Long before his name would echo through the charged corridors of American politics, Seth Conrad Rich was just a boy from Omaha, Nebraska, a quiet, freckle-faced kid with an easy grin, a baseball glove slung over one shoulder, and a habit of asking more questions than anyone else in the room. Born in 1989, the younger of two sons of Joel and Mary Rich, Seth grew up in a family where curiosity was encouraged, where dinner table talk revolved around community, fairness, and the small ways ordinary people could make a difference. He liked numbers, puzzles, and the gentle rhythm of neighborhood life, school, synagogue, little league, debate club. His teachers called him a natural listener, the kind of student who could mediate an argument and make both sides feel heard. Politics fascinated him early, not the shouting matches on television, but the mechanics underneath. He wanted to understand how decisions were made, how data became strategy, how people could be persuaded to care. At Central High School, he volunteered on student council campaigns, designing simple flyers on an aging computer in his parents' basement. In college at Creighton University, he studied political science and computer science, a rare blend that made sense to him. Data as empathy in numerical form. By junior year, he was working for local Democratic candidates, knocking on doors, building voter databases, mapping turnout patterns across Omaha's precincts. His professors described him as a cheerful wonk, part statistician, part optimist. When Seth graduated in 2011, he wanted Washington, not for the power but for the process. He imagined himself buried in spreadsheets in some forgotten campaign office, quietly improving democracy by one line of code at a time. His friends threw him a farewell party. He packed a worn duffel and drove east in an aging Toyota, a Nebraska flag folded in the trunk. The capital greeted him with humidity, monuments, and possibility. He landed his first steady job with Greenberg Quinlan Rossner, a political research firm known for data-driven polling. Seth built models of voter behavior, learning how campaigns translated demographics into persuasion. He worked long hours for modest pay, but he loved it. Colleagues remembered the way he stayed late, tinkering with maps until the colors looked right, humming under his breath. He was like a kid with Legos, one coworker said later. He wanted the whole thing to fit. By 2014, he'd earned a spot at the Democratic National Committee, the DNC, inside a modern glass office a few blocks from the Capitol. His title, Voter Expansion Data Director, didn't sound glamorous, but to Seth, it was everything. His job was to build tools that helped citizens register and vote, especially in states where access had grown complicated. He worked on geocoding polling places, refining databases so volunteers could reach voters more efficiently. It was nerd work, pure and simple, but it mattered. He believed in the math of democracy, a colleague said. He thought every percentage point was a life improved. Friends from Omaha visited and teased him about turning into a policy robot. Seth would laugh, point to the Lincoln Memorial, and talk about how numbers could save democracy if people just used them honestly. He lived in the Bloomingdale neighborhood, tree-lined streets, brick row houses, a mix of young professionals and old families. He biked to work, wore plaid shirts, and loved local sports bars where the Nationals games played on every screen. He was dating a woman named Kelsey, and they were serious enough to talk about moving in together. By all measures, life was finally clicking into place. But Washington in 2016 was not the city he'd first driven into. The presidential race had split the capital into factions. Inside the DNC, the air buzzed with stress, leaked emails, cyber attacks, and the growing sense that political discourse had become weaponized. Seth stayed focused on turnout data, trying to ignore the noise. He told friends he didn't care for partisanship. He cared for process. If people stop believing in the system, he said, then none of this means anything. Coworkers recalled how he'd stay late, headphones on, building models, then pedal home near midnight through the quiet streets. He was cautious, not reckless, kept his phone charged, texted his girlfriend when he got home. Yet he loved that sense of independence, the small-town kid making a difference in the nation's nerve center. July 2016 was sweltering. The DNC was gearing up for its convention in Philadelphia. Seth, exhausted but proud, talked about visiting Omaha afterward to see his parents. On Saturday night, July 9th, he met friends at a bar called Lou's City Bar in Columbia Heights to watch a Nationals game. He wore his favorite plaid shirt and ordered a few beers. The night was easy, ordinary. Around 1:30 a.m., he told friends he was heading home. They offered to call a ride, but he preferred to walk. The distance was just over 2 miles through well-lit streets. He left the bar, phone in hand, exchanging texts with Kelsey about weekend plans. "I'm almost home," one message read. It would be the last thing he ever wrote. At 4:19 a.m., residents of Flagler Place NW, a quiet block in Bloomingdale, heard two quick gunshots. A neighbor looked out a window and saw a man lying face down in the intersection, moving weakly. Police arrived within minutes to find Seth Rich bleeding from 2 wounds to the back. His wallet, watch, and phone were still on him. He was conscious when officers knelt beside him, whispering that he didn't know who shot him. An ambulance rushed him to MedStar Washington Hospital Center. He was pronounced dead less than 2 hours later, at 5:57 a.m., 27 years old. The homicide detectives logged it as a probable botched robbery. In the previous weeks, Bloomingdale had seen several muggings where assailants fled before taking belongings when resistance occurred. Seth fit the pattern, walking alone, early morning, cornered by strangers. But something about the untouched wallet unsettled people. Washington was used to crime, but not this kind. A young idealist, working to make voting easier, gunned down in the dark. It felt senseless. News of his death rippled through the DNC like an electrical current. Staffers cried openly. The morning's meetings stopped cold. He was the kind of person you wanted 10 of, one supervisor said. He never complained. He believed. In Omaha, his parents woke to phone calls from friends who had seen headlines online. Joel Rich, voice shaking, told reporters later that he thought it was a mistake, that Seth had simply been hurt. "We thought we'd be getting on a plane to help him heal," he said. "We never imagined we'd be planning a funeral." The funeral in Omaha drew hundreds: family, college friends, campaign colleagues, and local officials. They spoke of a man defined not by politics, but by purpose. The small-town kid who wanted to make democracy work. His mother read from a letter Seth had written years earlier for a youth leadership program. "I just want to make a difference." Those words, simple and unassuming, became a refrain. Back in Washington, detectives canvassed the neighborhood. Surveillance cameras from nearby businesses showed blurred glimpses of figures running through alleys around 4 a.m., but no clear faces. There were no witnesses who saw the shooter up close. Crime analysts mapped patterns, string of robberies, same quadrant, same time frame. The working theory remained random violence. Yet even before the evidence cooled, the story began to twist. Within days, internet forums and fringe outlets seized on the case, connecting Seth's job at the DNC to broader political narratives. Unverified claims, none supported by investigators, began to spread. Speculations that would later be debunked, but not before they overtook the tragedy itself. For his family, the grief doubled. First the loss, then the storm of misinformation. "They took our son's memory," Joel Rich said later. "They turned him into something he wasn't." For now, in those first stunned weeks, the focus was still on Seth the person, the friend who biked everywhere, the data geek who danced offbeat at parties, the colleague who brought donuts to the office on Mondays. His coworkers created a scholarship in his name at Creighton University, designed to support students working in civic technology. The DNC planted a tree outside its headquarters. On summer evenings, passers-by would stop, read the plaque, and leave small tokens, campaign buttons, folded notes. A Nebraska Cornhuskers cap. Washington moved on, as it always does, but for those who knew him, the city felt smaller, lonelier. The idea that a young man could dedicate his life to civic engagement only to die on a quiet street blocks from Capitol Hill felt like a cruel metaphor for the times. A democracy bleeding in the dark, asking for help that came too late. And in the months to come, that metaphor would be hijacked, weaponized, and reshaped into something Seth Rich never would have recognized. His life had been about facts and numbers. His death would become a battlefield of narratives, none of which he could defend. But before that storm broke, there was only the boy from Omaha, the idealist in plaid, who believed that if you understood the data, you could understand people, and that maybe, just maybe, you could help them believe in the system again. The last night of Seth Rich's life began the way so many Washington weekends do, with a baseball game, a bar, and talk about work that never quite leaves your mind. It was Saturday, July 9th, 2016, humid even after dark, the kind of sticky summer evening when the air along Georgia Avenue feels thick enough to slow conversation. At Lou's City Bar in Columbia Heights, televisions glowed red and white with the Nationals' colors. Seth, dressed in jeans and a checkered shirt, sat with a few friends and coworkers, talking about voter outreach data between innings. He laughed easily, ordered a couple of beers, and talked about his plans to visit his parents in Omaha once the Democratic National Convention wrapped. At 1:30 a.m., with the bar closing and the metro long since shut down, he said goodbye and stepped into the night. He didn't bother to hail a cab or rideshare. The walk home to Bloomingdale, a mile and a half south, had become his routine. He slipped in earbuds, scrolling through messages on his phone as he walked past shuttered shops and the glow of street lamps. The city was quiet. Washington, for all its noise by day, still sleeps early in its residential pockets. Around 2 a.m., his girlfriend, Kelsey, was texting him from another part of town. They had been discussing weekend plans and a new outfit he'd bought. The thread was ordinary, affectionate, the kind of small talk that fills the spaces of young relationships. At 2:05, Seth sent one more text. Almost home. After that, he kept listening to music and kept walking. In the hours that followed, cameras around Northwest D.C. recorded fragments of movement, people leaving bars, taxis coasting through lights, a man with a bicycle crossing Rhode Island Avenue. Somewhere within those hours, the city turned from Saturday into Sunday at 4:19 a.m. Two sharp sounds echoed across Flagler Place NW, a narrow street lined with row houses and parked cars. One neighbor thought they were fireworks. Another, lying awake in bed, knew instantly they were gunshots. When police arrived minutes later, they found a young man face down in the street, breathing but unable to speak more than a few words. The wallet was still in his pocket, his watch still on his wrist, the phone lying nearby with the screen cracked. The officer knelt beside him, pressed gauze against the wounds in his back, and asked who had shot him. Seth Rich tried to answer, but his voice was faint, the words unintelligible. Paramedics rushed him to MedStar Washington Hospital Center. Doctors fought to stabilize him for nearly 2 hours. At 5:57 a.m., they pronounced him dead. He was 27. Detectives from the Metropolitan Police Department's homicide branch arrived before sunrise. They marked shell casings on the asphalt, photographed the streetlight patterns, and interviewed half-asleep neighbors. There were no witnesses who saw the confrontation, no cameras that captured the shooter. The evidence pointed to an attempted robbery, a pattern that had struck the neighborhood repeatedly that summer. In several incidents, victims had been accosted by armed suspects who fled without stealing anything when resistance appeared. Still, the details felt off. 2 shots to the back, nothing taken, no footprints leading away. Detective Joseph DeLorso, one of the first on scene, later told reporters the case bothered him. "It looked like a robbery gone bad," he said, "but it didn't behave like one." By morning, the street was cleaned, the blood rinsed away by city workers. Only a small bouquet left by friends marking the spot. Word spread through the Democratic National Committee offices before noon. Staffers who had worked beside Seth on data analysis projects wept at their desks. Some drove to the hospital unaware he had already died. Donna Brazil, then a senior DNC figure, later described the mood as disbelief. They couldn't imagine harm coming to Seth. He was the least political person in the building. That afternoon, the department's spokesperson briefed reporters. The line was simple: "We believe Mr. Rich was the victim of an attempted robbery." They offered a $25,000 reward for information, later supplemented by private donations. The statement should have ended the matter. Washington's homicide numbers were grimly routine. But Seth wasn't routine. He worked for a national political organization in an election year that had already turned poisonous. And within hours, strangers online were spinning the emptiness of evidence into their own stories. First, the detectives ignored the noise. They canvassed pawn shops for the gun, checked area hospitals for suspects with gunshot wounds, reviewed camera footage block by block. They built a map of every robbery in a 2-mile radius. They logged shell casings, 9mm. No matches. When weeks passed with no arrests, they doubled the reward. Still nothing. Tips came in, some heartfelt, many wild, but none that matched reality. Meanwhile, Seth's family back in Omaha was living through the numbing logistics of loss. traveling to Washington to pack his apartment, meeting detectives, sitting through endless briefings. They were ordinary parents thrust into a procedural machine. Joel Rich described looking through his son's room and realizing how small the world of a 27-year-old could be, running shoes by the door, a DNC lanyard hanging from a hook, a whiteboard filled with voter registration numbers. He really believed he was helping people, Joel said. That's what keeps us going. The funeral, held at Bethel Synagogue in Omaha, overflowed. Seth's brother, Aaron, spoke of childhood summers building forts in their backyard, of his brother's habit of calling just to talk about turnout rates. We lost the guy who still believed data could make people kind. Outside, hundreds of people lined the sidewalk holding candles. Nebraska's governor ordered flags to half-staff. Back in D.C., detectives were realistic. Random street robberies are the hardest to solve. No relationship between victim and killer, no clear motive beyond opportunity. The city's CCTV network had gaps. Private cameras pointed the wrong way. The only hard evidence was 2 shell casings, a handful of cell tower pings, and a silence that wouldn't lift. Yet what made the investigation uniquely painful was the storm gathering beyond their control. As the presidential campaign accelerated, anonymous voices on social media began inventing alternate explanations. Within weeks, a swirl of false narratives was attaching itself to Seth's name. Detectives tried to tune it out, but for his family, each rumor was another wound. They were grieving a son while watching his memory transformed into digital mythology. Mary Rich, exhausted, pleaded publicly, "Stop politicizing my child's death. He was just walking home." Despite the chaos, the official casework continued quietly. Detectives cross-checked ballistics against recovered guns, hoping for a match in later robberies. By autumn, they were confident the killing fit the pattern of armed street crimes by small crews operating in Northeast D.C. Young men using handguns, often panicking when victims resisted. It was not the clean narrative the public wanted, but it was the one consistent with evidence that Seth's colleagues at the DNC created the Seth Rich Voter Protection Fund, channeling grief into purpose. The foundation financed scholarships and new outreach tools for young civic tech workers. Each year, a data mapping award bearing his name recognized innovations in election accessibility. It was the kind of legacy he would have understood by late 2016. The flag on Flagler Place had been replaced by a street sign reading "Rich Way." Neighbors still remembered the sirens that morning, the way dawn broke over police tape. For them, Seth's murder was not a symbol, just a loss, a reminder that even in Washington, a city built on big stories, tragedy is almost always small and personal, but outside that quiet block, the story was already escaping the control of evidence. What had begun as a single unsolved homicide was mutating into a national myth. Reshaped by agendas far from where the gunshots rang out, the investigation would go on, methodical, limited, human, but the world would soon drown it in noise. And Seth Rich, the young analyst who believed truth could be measured in data, would become the center of a storm built entirely from lies. Silence cracked open, not with evidence, but with noise. The official story was still simple. A young DNC employee had been shot during an apparent robbery. Police had no suspects, no motive beyond chance. But in the long, fevered summer of 2016, chance wasn't something people trusted anymore. The presidential campaign was devouring the city. Hackers had breached party servers, emails were leaking by the thousands, and every headline carried the scent of scandal. Into that atmosphere of suspicion, Seth's unsolved death landed like a match in dry grass. Within days, corners of the internet began muttering that maybe it wasn't a random street crime. Anonymous posts on forums proposed that he'd been silenced. None offered proof. All ignored the police record. But the narrative was convenient, and convenience spreads faster than truth. By late July, national reporters were fielding calls from strangers demanding to know what the DNC was hiding. The Rich family, still sorting through condolence letters, suddenly faced emails from conspiracy enthusiasts claiming to know the real story. Joel Rich would later say that it felt like losing Seth twice. First to the bullets, then to rumor. "They took our son's death," he told NPR, "and made it a weapon." Washington's homicide detectives found themselves dragged into a political vortex. Sergeant Sean Hickey, one of the supervisors, spoke carefully at the department's next press briefing. We have no information to suggest anything other than a robbery. But the statement barely registered amid the roar of speculation. Cable shows repeated the same phrase, unanswered questions, until it sounded like evidence of its own. Through the fall and winter, the story metastasized online. Blog headlines grew darker, theories more elaborate. A private investigator briefly hired by a media personality made public claims that contradicted his own contract, and though he later walked them back, the damage was done. National outlets repeated the allegations before verifying them, then retracted under pressure. Each correction arrived too late. Screenshots had already gone viral. The family's phone rang constantly with reporters asking about documents that didn't exist inside their Omaha home. Joel and Mary Rich watched their son's photograph appear beside phrases like cover-up and scandal. They begged journalists to stop. They wrote open letters describing Seth as he really was, a data analyst, not a spy, not a symbol. He believed in democracy, Mary Rich wrote. Please let him rest in it. But the internet has no brakes. Each plea only fed the search engine results that kept his name trending. By spring 2017, the situation had tipped from rumor to harassment. Strangers camped outside the Rich house, waving cell phone cameras. Some mailed threatening notes accusing the family of lying. The D.C. police, alarmed, assigned a liaison officer to the parents. Detectives quietly resubmitted DNA from the crime scene for advanced testing, anything to shift attention back to the real investigation, but no new matches emerged. Then came the night of May 16, 2017, when a major cable network aired a segment resurrecting the false claims. It cited anonymous sources and implied a political motive. Within 24 hours, the Rich family's lawyers demanded a retraction. Within a week, the network pulled the story and apologized. Still, the broadcast had reached millions. Joel Rich later told the Washington Post, "You can correct a headline, but you can't unread it." In the months that followed, multiple independent investigations by the FBI, the Washington Post, the New York Times, and others reviewed every available fact. All reached the same conclusion. There was no evidence linking Seth Rich's death to his work or to any political controversy. The Metropolitan Police Department maintained that the most plausible explanation remained a botched robbery. Even the U.S. intelligence community, in reports to Congress, confirmed that the DNC data breaches had been carried out by foreign hackers, not insiders. Yet the myth persisted online, repeated in memes, podcasts, and videos that blurred fact and fiction until they were indistinguishable to the casual viewer. The people who actually knew him. The spectacle was unbearable. Friends from college formed a quiet group called Seth Circle, meeting monthly in D.C. coffee shops to share updates and memories. They avoided social media entirely. Every time we posted a photo, one said, trolls hijacked the comments. They decided the best memorial was private kindness, volunteering for voter registration drives, finishing projects Seth had started. Meanwhile, the police kept working the case the old-fashioned way, door-to-door interviews, neighborhood canvasses, the slow grind of homicide work without national cameras. By 2018, the reward fund exceeded $300,000, an enormous sum for a local case. Still no arrests. Detective Del Greco, newly assigned, summarized the frustration. We have motive theory, we have physical evidence, but we don't have the triggerman. And now we're fighting ghosts on the internet instead of suspects on the street. In 2019, the Rich family filed defamation suits against several media outlets and individuals who had profited from the false narratives. Court documents revealed how social media algorithms had amplified the claims for clicks and revenue. The cases stretched on for years but ultimately produced retractions, settlements, and, most importantly, public acknowledgments that the conspiracy stories were baseless. It wasn't about money, Joel Rich said. It was about putting truth in writing. Through it all, the real investigation remained open. Police continued to treat the homicide as unsolved but active. In early 2020, detectives briefed reporters once more. We have no indication this was anything other than an attempted robbery. We still seek the community's help. The statement was familiar, nearly identical to the one issued 4 years earlier. Yet repeating it mattered, a small act of resistance against a tide of fiction. That same year, amid the pandemic's isolation, the Rich family hosted a virtual memorial on what would have been Seth's 31st birthday. Friends logged in from Omaha, D.C., and beyond. They told stories about his dry humor, his obsession with baseball statistics, his belief that small data points could tell big truths. Someone shared his old playlist, classic rock mixed with campaign songs. For 2 hours, the chat filled with memories instead of arguments. It was, Mary Rich said later, the first time in years it felt like Seth belonged to us again. The larger world moved on. The theories that once dominated headlines faded into the background noise of countless other controversies. But the damage they left behind lingered, in the erosion of public trust, in the caution with which journalists now approached online sources, and in the private exhaustion of one Nebraska family who had become unwilling experts on the cost of misinformation. The truth, stripped of rumor, was still heartbreakingly ordinary. A 27-year-old idealist walked home on a summer night, crossed paths with armed strangers, and died before sunrise. No greater meaning, no secret agenda, just a random act of violence in a city where such acts happen too often and draw too little attention. That ordinariness, detectives said, was what made it hardest to solve. People want a story big enough for their grief, one investigator explained. But sometimes the story is small and cruel, and that's all there is. By 2021, Seth Rich's name had become a cautionary tale in journalism schools, a reminder of how quickly rumor can eclipse reality. His parents, weary but resolute, began speaking at conferences on digital ethics. Our son loved data because he believed numbers couldn't lie, Joel Rich told one audience. He didn't realize how easily people could lie about numbers. 6 years after the shooting, the case file remained open, 2 boxes thick, stored in the homicide archives on Indiana Avenue. The pages told no grand conspiracy, no coded messages, just witness statements, phone logs, lab reports, and a father's handwritten note clipped to the front. Please don't forget him. The storm that had raged around Seth Rich's name finally began to quiet, though the sky never cleared completely. Online, the myths still flickered, refusing to die entirely. But beneath them, the real story endured, fragile, factual, and human. A young man who believed in democracy had been killed, and the truth about that night was simple. It had always been simple. It was the world that refused to believe it. The years that followed Seth Rich's death stretched out like a long corridor of hearings, headlines, and half-truths. Yet through all of it, one thing remained steady: the determination of a small Nebraska family who refused to let their son's life be reduced to rumor. By 2018. The Washington Metropolitan Police Department had exhausted nearly every local lead. The original homicide team rotated off the case, leaving it classified as open, unsolved. A new set of detectives reviewed the file from scratch: interviews, autopsy notes, ballistics, surveillance footage. The evidence was unchanged: 2 shell casings, both from the same 9mm weapon. No DNA beyond the victims. No fingerprints. Whoever fired the shots had left nothing behind but absence. Still, the case never slipped into storage. Each year, detectives re-examined similar robberies in the same quadrant of the city, looking for ballistic matches. It's what we call a cold case rotation, one investigator explained. You keep shaking the tree in case something falls. But nothing did. The streets changed, storefronts closed, security cameras improved, and Flagler Place went quiet again. Far from the crime scene, the Rich family was learning a different kind of endurance. They had filed lawsuits not only to protect their son's name, but to establish a record, a legal paper trail affirming what the police had been saying all along. In 2021, several of those suits concluded with settlements and public statements of retraction from major outlets that had repeated false claims years earlier. Joel Rich stood before microphones outside the courthouse, gray-haired and tired, but resolved. "We can't bring Seth back," he said, "but maybe we can stop this from happening to the next family." In private, he and Mary still spoke about Seth in the present tense. His room in Omaha stayed almost untouched. The campaign posters, the D.C. bike helmet, the rows of baseball caps. They started a small foundation to support civic tech scholarships and partnered with Creighton University to host lectures on truth in media. Every July, they lit a candle in their kitchen window at 4:19 a.m., the minute the gunshots had sounded on Flagler Place. It's not ritual, Mary said. It's remembering that the world kept turning after he stopped. Meanwhile, requests for information about the investigation kept coming from journalists, advocacy groups, and conspiracy believers alike. In 2020, under the Freedom of Information Act, the FBI released hundreds of pages of documents showing that it had provided limited technical assistance to D.C. police, analyzing Seth Rich's laptop for digital clues at the city's request, but it found no connection to any political activity or data theft. The Bureau's statement was brief and careful. The FBI has not determined that Seth Rich's death was related to his employment or to any data breach incident. Yet, even a simple disclosure spawned another wave of speculation online. Proof again that transparency can feed the same hunger it tries to quiet. Inside police headquarters on Indiana Avenue, the homicide file grew thicker only by inches. New witness tips, mostly false. Lab rechecks. Administrative updates. Detective Del Greco kept the case number on his corkboard, reminding younger officers that some investigations last a lifetime. You don't close it, he said. You wait for somebody to talk. But in a transient city like Washington, people move, memories fade, and the code of the street, don't snitch, remains stronger than grief. The political world that had turned Seth's death into a talking point had long since moved on to other controversies. The fever had cooled, but not disappeared. His name still surfaced whenever misinformation researchers traced the early architecture of modern online propaganda. In academic circles, the Seth Rich episode became shorthand for how a single tragedy could metastasize into global disinformation, a case study in the speed at which empathy is replaced by agenda. Universities used it to teach media literacy. Newsroom editors cited it when drafting new verification standards. It was a legacy he never asked for, but one that, paradoxically, carried his lifelong belief in data and truth. For the Rich family, the focus shifted from justice to preservation. They worked with community organizations in Omaha and D.C. to fund Safer Streets initiatives, helping install better lighting and neighborhood cameras in Bloomingdale. They hosted voter registration drives each summer in Seth's memory, turning his work into action. The scholarship that bore his name began producing graduates, young analysts who spoke passionately about ethics and technology. One recipient wrote them a letter. Mr. and Mrs. Rich, your son showed me that civic data isn't numbers. It's people. They framed it beside his photograph in 2022. The D.C. police released a quiet update confirming that the investigation was still active, that detectives still believed robbery was the most likely motive, and that the department continued to seek public assistance. The statement ended with a line from Police Chief Robert Connie. We owe the Rich family an answer, and we remain committed to finding it. It was bureaucratic, but sincere. The reward fund still stood at $300,000. Leads still trickled in. The homicide file remained open. When reporters revisited the story that year, they found a city that had changed. The intersection of West Street and Flagler Place now held newer row houses, painted bright colors, with small security cameras blinking above the doors. Locals still remembered the night of the sirens. He was just a kid walking home, one longtime resident said. Every time I pass that corner, I think about how fast life can turn. In the larger arc of American true crime, Seth Rich's case remained an outlier, not because of how it happened, but because of what followed. Thousands of young people are murdered each year in cities across the country. Few become global symbols. Fewer still become the subjects of elaborate falsehoods. His death exposed something fragile in the national psyche: how easily grief can be hijacked when institutions are mistrusted and facts are optional. The lesson endured long after headlines moved on. By 2023, Joel and Mary had learned to live alongside the mystery. They kept in touch with detectives, reading every small update. Once a year, they traveled to D.C. to place flowers near the spot where their son had fallen. They no longer spoke to cameras. Their public advocacy had softened into quiet resilience. If you let anger run your life, Joel said in one interview, you lose him all over again. In that same year, a documentary filmmaker approached them about producing a film on the human cost of misinformation. The Riches agreed only on the condition that it focus on empathy rather than politics. When it premiered at an independent festival, audiences expected outrage. Instead, they found tenderness, a portrait of parents who had turned sorrow into education. and of a young man whose decency had outlasted the noise around him. The closing line came from Seth's own college essay. The easiest way to lose faith in democracy is to stop participating in it. The theater fell silent when the lights came up at AS of today. The murder of Seth Rich remains unsolved. The case file is still active within the Metropolitan Police Department's Major Crimes Division. The official theory remains attempted robbery. No credible evidence has ever linked his death to his work or to any political plot. The FBI, the Department of Justice, and multiple independent media investigations have all affirmed that conclusion. It is a simple truth that took years to reclaim from the chaos. Some nights, especially near July anniversaries, reporters still drive past the intersection where the gunfire rang out, watching porch lights blink on and off in the warm D.C. air. The city sounds the same, sirens in the distance, the faint hum of traffic toward North Capitol Street. Life continues, unbothered by what it refuses to solve. And yet for those who remember, that corner remains sacred ground, a place where idealism met randomness and where a nation's hunger for meaning spun tragedy into myth. If there is one thing the Rich family has taught through their persistence, it is that not every question deserves an answer, but every person deserves truth. In the end, the truth about Seth Rich is the one his friends always knew: a kind, funny, endlessly curious young man who believed democracy worked best when people cared enough to fix it. The rest, the noise, the politics, the endless speculation, was never about him at all.